All right. Good morning again, especially to the two that weren't here. I said it the last time I said it. It really is good to see all of you. You know, it's weird, though, being in a new building, new building, sort of a new order to services. I keep feeling like I'm going to mess something up somehow. It's not really that hard or anything, but it's just that feeling of coming and preaching at a new place is here just because we're in a new building, even though I have the same faces in front of me. It's weird. It's weird. So, has anyone here watched any skits by the comedian Tim Hawkins? One, two, few of you, mostly family. Yeah. Let's broaden it out a little more. What about Weird Al? Who here has heard a song by Weird Al? Pretty much everyone. Weird Al's been around a while. Way back, I think his first hits were back with Queen and Michael Jackson doing some parodies of them. And this is the only time I'm going to ask you to kind of interact with me here in the sermon for a bit. If you were to name one Weird Al song, first one that pops into your head, what would it be? Just raise your hand and then I'll point on you. You give me an answer. I'm fat. Eat it. Eat It's mine. Eat It is his best song parody. Have you seen the music video for that? It's fantastic. Perfect. Tim Hawkins also does some parody songs, not as many as Weird Al. He does a lot of stand-up and stuff. The first song that comes to mind with him is... Chick-fil-A. Yeah.
I was going to say, please, take the read.
Okay, well, I was looking for that one. But, yeah. Why is it that all of these comedians sing so many songs about food? Right? Weird Al's got Eat It, he's got I'm Fat, he's got Girls Just Want to Have Lunch, he's got several songs about just being an inactive glutton and watching TV all day. Just all of these comedic songs about food. And why is that? Because as a culture, for some reason, we think overeating is hilarious. We do, honestly. Like, I see this in all sorts of comedic sketches. I see it in all sorts of parody songs all over the place. If we see someone go and, they've had a bad breakup, they're a teenager, I guess an adult in this case, they had a bad breakup and they go home and they drown their sorrows in a bottle of wine, you think, man, that's debauchery right there. They shouldn't do that. There are more constructive ways to do that. But if they buy an entire gallon of ice cream and sit there and just start shoveling it in, that's hilarious. See, I see people like grinning or laughing. That's funny. So this morning I want to talk to you about gluttony. I've never heard a sermon in my entire life on gluttony. I did some studying over the weekend and a little bit past about gluttony because I had never heard a sermon on it. I didn't know where to go. Looked in the Bible, found some very interesting things. This is just going to kind of be an informal result of my studying because I found some things that kind of surprised me. Because gluttony is one of the big 7 deadly sins that Christians culturally talk about, and yet we never talk about it. So I've got questions to ask, like how seriously should we take it? If it's the cultural joke, if we're conditioned to not take it seriously, how should we be treating this idea, this supposed sin? What does the Bible say about it? And if you don't think you're indoctrined to think that overeating, that food urges are funny, Carrie, could you flip the slide? Ever since childhood. This character is literally just gluttony incarnate. There is no other facets to his character. He is not the only cartoon character meant for kids that has gluttony either as his entire personality or as part of it. I can think of one particular SpongeBob character who can inhale a cheeseburger like it's nothing. Or you can go all the way back to Scooby-Doo and Shaggy. It's everywhere. And it's not taken seriously, and I've never heard a sermon on it. So we're going to talk about it this morning. And I've got 3 questions to ask. How serious is gluttony? Is it a sin? Is it just a problem? Is it just what is it? What is it? Like, what do we need to know about it? Why is it in the Bible? Why is it considered the way it is? And how do we deal with it? So, is it serious? Why? And then how do we deal with it? So the first thing we want to do is be like, well, in the first place, is gluttony a sin? Is it something that is going to separate us from God? Is it that kind of problem? Let's go to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians 5 is where we'll start. It has my favorite list of sins in the entire Bible because of what it says about them. In Galatians chapter 5, it talks about the fruits of the Spirit while it's saying walk by the Spirit. And then it says in verse 19 of Galatians chapter 5, now the works of the flesh are evident. Some versions say the works of the flesh are obvious. Like, this is obviously bad, you guys. Don't do it. And that's what he's talking about. He's trying to take all sin, shove it into this category, and be like, you know this is wrong. You know this is wrong. It shouldn't be anything that I have to teach you. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I've warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Did you hear gluttony on that list? I didn't either. That was the first place I went to look for gluttony without doing any Google searches or anything like that. I went there, and I was like, where's it at? We got these 7 deadly sins. Gluttony's missing. Sloth is too, but that's a completely different subject. Gluttony is missing. It is not specifically condemned here. There is this and the like, but I have a hard time comparing gluttony to something like fits of anger or drunkenness or orgies. I'm not sure where to put that in the list, so let's kind of push that off to the side for now. It's not really there. It's not in this explicit condemnation. So then I began my search. Are there any examples in the Bible of gluttons being condemned? Of God saying, this person is a glutton, and so they are to be put to death, or they are to be punished, or they are to be sent to hell, or they are not a Christian. They are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. I looked for that. It's not as easy as you might think. Let's turn to Ezekiel. We're going to have to hit the Old Testament for some of God's feelings about gluttony. In Ezekiel, I found a little nugget, a small nugget, not a big nugget, not a McNugget. If I can find Ezekiel. This is not my normal Bible. Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel chapter 16, in verse 48 beginning, it says, as I live, declares the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom, Sodom and Gomorrah. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Some versions, instead of saying excess of food there, they say they were overfed. They were haughty and did an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw it. There are a lot of other passages in the Bible about Sodom and Gomorrah's sins and how they were also, kind of rapey and that sort of stuff. They had a lot more going on. But this here specifically says that they were condemned because they had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. So that's listed there. That's a little iffy because it's kind of combined with a bunch of other stuff. We'll go back to that later. In Philippians chapter 3, over in the New Testament, Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 18, it says, for many of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly. And they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. One of the descriptions of these people that are enemies of Christ is that they are gluttons. This is a very extreme case. Their God is their belly. They seek only to glorify themselves, their pleasures, their stomach. That is sort of what gluttony is. But there is an example of it saying that they are enemies of the cause of Christ. There are a few other less direct examples. In Titus 1 in verse 12, Paul says, I have heard a report about these people you're going to go visit, the Cretans, that they are lazy gluttons and evil brutes. He says, and they're not wrong. So rebuke them for it. So lazy gluttons there is kind of paired with evil brutes. In Psalm 78, we'll go ahead and turn there. It's a recounting of one of Israel's stories with a little bit of insight from God's perspective. In Psalm 78, beginning in verse 26, back when they were in the wilderness, it says, He, that is God, caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by His power He led out of the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were well filled, for He gave them what they craved. But before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose up against them, and He killed the strongest of them and laid low the young men of Israel. God gave them the meat that they were craving, but then He punished them for it. And if you look at this example, this Bible story that is kind of summed up here, it's all the way back in Exodus. You can look for it, you can find it. They were criticized, I believe, for their unthankfulness. They complained, they murmured against God, they complained about this manna that they've been being fed. And God sent them quail, but then struck them as they ate it because they were not thankful for what they had. They craved, they wanted, they were gluttonous. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, the last example I'm going to go to, this is probably the strongest one, the strongest condemnation you could get, because it's literally a part of the old law. But it, again, is paired with some other things. Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning in verse 18. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and, though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of the city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. I almost find this, this is not a funny passage. I almost find this strange. It's a strange thing. The sin of rebellion against God and against the authorities, against your parents, is treated more harshly than most other sins in the Old Testament. When you keep that in mind, this passage sort of makes sense. When you rebel against your parents and the authority given to them, you're rebelling against God. There's a reason honor your father and mother is the fifth commandment that the children of Israel were given. It was really important. When they come before them, and they say, This son of ours, in verse 20, is rebellious and stubborn. He will not obey our voice. You didn't have to say anything else. The son is stubborn and rebellious. He's not going to do what they say. But they go ahead and say what he's doing instead. He's a drunkard and a glutton. He's eating and drinking. The main thing they're talking about here is rebellion, but it's mentioned that he is a glutton and that he is glutting himself instead of doing what his parents tell him to do. That's most of the references to gluttony you can find in the Bible, at least those that condemn it. There are several verses that describe sinners as lovers of pleasure as well, and I think we could all agree that food can be pretty pleasurable, and that if you love it too much, that could be construed as being lovers of pleasure. That kind of goes back to that their God is their belly verse that we read a little while ago. If they worship that, if they indulge in that, if they glorify themselves in that. So, what's the answer? Is gluttony a sin? From these passages that we've read, is gluttony a sin? It's difficult, because there is a counter-argument you can make. You could say these are all circumstances where the gluttony is a desire, and it's connected with other sins. Gluttony connected with idolatry. Oh, they worship it too much. They follow it too much. Or they follow it on with idolatrous feasts to other idols and such. That's one thing you could bring out of some translations of verses. It's brought on with greed for money, greed for greed for food, greed for the things that they want to have. It's brought on with inhospitality. It was talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. It wasn't a sin that they ate too much. It was a sin that they ate so much and then didn't give to anyone else because they clearly had extra food. See, that was the problem, right? Or it's paired with drunkenness because if you're eating a lot, I'm sure that you're drinking a lot. Or with ungratefulness, like in the desert. Or with laziness, like with the sun, and disobedience. It's always paired with these things. It's always a desire that's gone along with these things. But maybe it's not actually a sin. You could sort of make that argument. And because every one of these verses focuses on something else, whenever we go to that passage about the people eating quail in the wilderness, we don't focus on gluttony. We focus on unthankfulness. And we do the same with all of these other passages, and we just kind of forget about gluttony and leave it out. But it's not necessarily condemned as directly as most other sins. So all of these problems, all of these other sins that it's with, we look at those and we don't look at gluttony. Is it fair, though, to say that gluttony is a sin? Is it okay to gorge ourselves as long as we're hospitable about it and we let other people gorge themselves? Is it okay to love food and to, go and eat too much? Who says too much, right? Eat too much as long as you're not worshiping, as long as you're not putting it above God. Or as long as it's not in service to other gods in a feast. As long as I'm not drinking a bunch of wine with it. As long as I'm not being lazy about it. As long as I'm grateful for what I've been given. And so on and so forth. That's what we do right now. And so I don't have the answer for that. I don't have an answer as to whether gluttony is explicitly a sin. I think that defining sins like that is kind of a waste of time anyways some of the time. But I don't have an answer as to whether gluttony is, this will separate you from God. This is gluttony. It will separate you from God. And to get a better idea of how God feels about gluttony, and to get a better idea of how we should feel about gluttony, I think we should move on to our next thing. Not is gluttony serious, because it's paired with other sins, but we kind of get a vague idea of it. We need to look at why. Why is gluttony a problem? Why is gluttony serious? And then we can look at the way it affects our walk with God, and we can make that decision as to what we eat for ourselves. Because I'm not comfortable saying that it is a sin when you've got things that say the works of the flesh are obvious, or here are the list of sins. Even in the old law, where they enumerated every single sin one after the other, that one passage that I read to you is the only reference to gluttony. And he's not being condemned for gluttony, he's being condemned for rebellion. Gluttony is not ever called a sin directly in the Bible without something else paired with it. And so I want to look at why gluttony is a problem. And to do that, we'll go to the Proverbs. We'll start in Proverbs chapter 23. But we're going to be jumping around a little bit. The Proverbs are interesting because they are words of wisdom that will help you to follow God. They are not, and they should not in any case, be used to condemn behavior. Because, unless it specifically says, this should be condemned and it will not go. But most of the time it says, this is not a good idea. This is unwise. This is foolishness. Or this is wise. This is prudent. This is wisdom. In Proverbs 23, beginning in verse 1, it says, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to, this version says, appetite. Some versions say gluttony. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. This could mean a lot of things. If you are a king, which is what Proverbs was written to, and you go and you eat with a foreign leader, what do you need to worry about as an Israelite king? Well, they could be trying to poison you. Or they could be feeding you something that doesn't look like it's bad, but it is against the dietary laws that they were given in the Old Testament. You can't eat this, you can't eat this. And it says, so there are reasons that you should be careful, but on the other hand, it says, put a knife to your throat. It's taking this idea of not being able to control yourself at the table very seriously. Now, this is again a passage of Proverbs, of wisdom, but if you are wise, put a knife to your throat. It is better to basically threaten yourself with death than to let yourself lose control of your body. It's not as applicable to us because we don't have the dietary laws and we don't eat poison, right? Right? Sugar's not poisonous, right? It's not a very slow poison or anything. Sugar can be very dangerous to your body, but we'll move on. This is not a dietary lesson. We're looking at gluttony. Down in verse 19 of the same chapter, it says, "Hear, my son, and be wise, and direct your heart in the way. Be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags." I like this verse because it gives a reason. Don't hang out with the gluttons and the drunkards because they will come to poverty, lose their jobs, they're going to lose their money. Why would they lose their money? You think of a good common sense reason? Think about the Bible times. Why would they lose their money from being gluttons and drunkards? It's kind of hard to eat when you're bloated, right? Or work when you're bloated, right? It's kind of hard to work when you're drunk, right? And where are they getting all this food and drink they didn't need? Money. They're spending money and they're unable to make it because they're spending it all on food and drink, and they're unable to make it because they're bloated and drunk. So they come to poverty. We don't have as many problems with that because we live in this nation of plenty. We have all-you-can-eat buffets that you can walk into. It's not as big of a problem, but the same principle sort of applies in the work of the Lord. How easy would it be for me to come up here and preach a lesson if I had just gorged myself, if I had eaten like 5 bagels, and I come up here, I'd be feeling pretty terrible. I would. And it also comes to mind, as far as the idea of spending your money on food. If you're spending money on rich delicacies, you're going to all these fancy restaurants, and you're just looking forward to that next pleasurable meal, and that's what you're looking for. That's what you're pushing yourself towards. That's the goal. What else could you be doing with your money that would be better for supporting your family, for the work of the Lord, for your long-term finances? It's not a great idea. I shouldn't be going to something like Texas de Brazil, which costs $50 for a meal every time that I get the chance. Let's look. Sorry, I'm stuttering over myself because this is somewhat disorganized material since it's sort of difficult to group everything. If you go back to our previous passages that we were looking at, the rebellious and useless son, it's kind of got that same idea. He's a glutton. He's a drunkard. He's lazy. He doesn't do what his parents wanted him to do because he's just enjoying himself in the pleasures of life, in eating and drinking. That psalm that we looked at about the Israelites being unthankful because they didn't appreciate the food that they had. There's a passage in the New Testament where Paul says, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. I know how to have very little and I know how to survive with great abundance. A glutton knows how to survive with great abundance. Do they know how to be abased? If you have gluttonous desire, if gluttony is a continuous failing of yours, and then all of the good foods were taken away from you, and you were forced to eat, as the Israelites did, manna and water for months on end, could you handle it? Could you handle that? If you have gluttonous desires, could you handle that? Sodom's inhospitality we talked about in Ezekiel. If there's a certain amount of food available. Have you ever been to an event or been to a family, or not even a family gathering, but a gathering where people start going through the line? It's a potluck, or it's a catered dinner, or something like that. And the people that first go through the line are like, yeah, I want some of that, I want some of that, I want some of that, I want some of that. And they take it, put all on their plates, and they run out of food before it gets to the end of the line. I've had that happen twice in the past year at gatherings that my workplace put on, because the engineers are just like, free food. They pull it all on their plate, and by the time that 3/4 of the line was gone, I walked through and I was like, cool, beans. Well, that's all they got. And I went and I ate. It can be a problem today. It really can. In hospitality. When you look at all these different examples, gluttony doesn't have to be labeled as a sin. We looked at in the first part, how serious is gluttony? Is gluttony labeled a sin? It's paired with a lot of sins. Gluttony doesn't have to be labeled a sin because it is a desire that can hinder us to sin. Is lust a sin? Sort of, yes. It is a disordered desire that can lead us into different sins. That feeling, that hunger, is not a sin. It can be used in a particularly helpful way. In the same way, hunger is not a sin. Wanting food is not a sin. And eating is not a problem. You need to eat. That desire is there for a reason. But when it becomes disordered, when it takes over your life, it can lead you into all of these sins. It can be to become our God. It can cause us to be inhospitable, lazy, useless. The Bible says To him who knows how to do something and good and does not do it, to him it is sin. If you see something that needs to be done and you're like, nah, I don't feel like it. Something good that you could do to help the cause of Christ, nah, I don't want to do that. This opportunity has been put before you, but yeah, I'm just too lazy. I don't feel like doing that. When I go and I overeat, I don't know about you, but I feel really lazy afterward. I feel like it's nap time. I don't feel like doing anything. Gluttony can cause you to become lazy or useless due to bloat. It can cause you to become unthankful when you don't have the gluttonous amount of food that you want to eat. It can cause you to be greedy. It can cause you to covet other people's food. It can cause you to disobey authority, mostly if you have parents and they're like, "Now you don't eat that cookie. You're not going to have any cookies until after dinner. You can have one cookie then, just one." It can cause you to disobey authority. There are all these things that gluttony can lead you into. The Bible never labels it a sin to eat too much, but it is dangerous if you want to, if you have that gluttonous desire, because it can lead you away. I kind of could compare it to missing church. It's not a sin to miss gathering together at church. The Bible says, don't forsake the gathering of yourselves together. It doesn't label that a sin. It doesn't say anything like that. It just says it's not good to stay away from other Christians because you need to build yourself up. If you don't want to come to church, if you don't want to worship God, if you don't want to be around other Christians, that's a problem, and it's going to lead you into all kinds of sin. If you want to continually overeat, if you just have this strong desire for food that you can't handle, then your desires are not in the right place, and it can either be a symptom or a cause of eventual sin, and it can drive you away. It's not as serious, you have an occasional problem with gluttony. It's not as serious as you going and fornicating all the time, or being a habitual liar or a thief or something. It's not labeled as a sin, but it is a desire that can lead you into all kinds of problems. So how do we deal with this desire? How do we deal with gluttony, this desire that can lead us into all kinds of sin? And the answer is, most of us don't. Have you seen America? But no, most of us don't. And I didn't for the longest time. And I'm not saying I'm perfect now, because yesterday I had this wonderful, I had 2 waffles, right? And they were cinnamon roll waffles. And I don't have any idea how they made them, but they took them and they put them into I don't know if they just took cinnamon rolls and smashed them in a waffle press. I don't have any idea. They were amazing, and I'm still feeling them. And that's why gluttony keeps coming to mind. Back last December, I got really sick and had to have my gallbladder taken out. And for some reason, this doesn't happen to anybody else that I've talked to, but for some reason now, whenever I overeat even the slightest, whenever I eat something that I am not supposed to, whenever I eat something that was motivated not by nutrition and not by actual hunger, but by boredom or, ooh, that looks like it would taste really, really good even though it's not healthy, or, wow, this is really good, I can't get enough of it, I'm just going to keep eating it even though I'm full. Anytime I get even slightly past that line, I will feel it for days. It's like my body has gone from being able to just handle whatever I feed it. Back when I was a teenager, I could eat 4 hamburgers in one sitting and it'd be fine. It's gone from that to being an actual meter for if you don't eat what's right, if you go one smidgen over, I'll let you know. And not everybody's body is like that, but I realized how much I was eating unhealthily. I realized how much I was overeating all of the time. I used to have trouble keeping myself down to I think it's 2,000 and something calories a day. Now I have trouble getting up to that because I realize I don't need that much. And my stomach lets me know when I have eaten too much. And upon realizing that, I'm like, wow, I'm way more gluttonous than I thought I was. And I started looking around and doing some research and trying to deal with it. And like I said before, I'm not trying to condemn anybody in this room. This is not a sin. This is something I want you to keep in mind as you go through your life, this desire that we need to not do away with. We don't need to starve ourselves, but to curtail, to keep ourselves healthier both spiritually and physically so that we can do the Lord's work. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 12, Paul says, "All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything." Paul says, I can eat whatever I want. That's fine. But I'm not going to let it enslave me. I'm not going to let it enslave me. He didn't want to give the devil a foothold in his gluttony to try to drive him to sin. And he's not specifically saying about gluttony here. He's talking about sexual immorality and other unclean things, including gluttony. In chapter 9 of the same book, in verse 27, he says, I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should become disqualified. One of the versions that I've read says, I discipline my body like an athlete. It's really weird to think about, because when I was younger and I read that verse, I thought, oh, he disciplines his body. That means he just disciplines his urges so that he can act like a Christian. That idea of like an athlete, that bringing your body into submission. Paul was fit, apparently, and he said that helped him in his Christian walk. That's crazy to think about, because that goes completely against everything that I've thought my entire life. It helps him he doesn't say it's a sin not to do this. He doesn't say it's a sin not to discipline your body. He says, I discipline my body because it helps me physically to do that. It's difficult to eat like a glutton and not let that desire master you, like Paul talks about. So I'm getting into the third subject. How do we deal with this? It's self-control. That's all it is. That's the hardest thing that God ever asks us to put on. In 2 Peter, it says self-control as one of the, Peter has the list of add to your faith, virtue, knowledge, more like so on. He says add your self-control to yourself and then make it abound. And that is one of the hardest things the Bible ever asks us to do. Self-control in all aspects of our life. Paul had that. And he used that as his defense against the desires of the flesh. That's really difficult. It's really difficult. But you know what's also difficult? Once you realize that it's happening, when you go out and you eat somewhere and you feel yourself actually losing control, like you look at something and you're like, I know I don't want that, but I'm about to eat it anyways, and my brain has absolutely no input on what my hand and mouth are doing right now. Because I've been there. And that can be scary when you realize that, when you don't treat it as a joke like so many comedians do. And I'm not dogging the comedians, their songs are hilarious, but that when you get into that mindset, it's actually scary when you go there and you look down and you're like, I just ate 5 rolls. What am I doing? Why did I do this? I didn't even think about it. I just did. In Proverbs kind of goes back and gives that proper balance. Proverbs chapter 25. There's a really interesting set of verses that are in here. Proverbs 25 and verse 16 says, if you have found honey was something that they found. They didn't have honey factories like we do, big beehive places. And honey was their main source of sweetener. They didn't have cane sugar, and bless their hearts, they didn't have high fructose corn syrup. They had honey. And it says, if you find honey, in verse 16, eat only enough for you. It's fine for you to eat honey. It just says, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. That seems like an obvious thing, but we overeat to the point where we don't feel well all the time. In chapter 25, same chapter, verse 27, he says the same thing. It is not good to eat much honey, nor is it glorious to seek one's own glory. That second half doesn't matter as much but to us in this particular circumstance. It is not good to eat much honey. Kind of just practical health advice. But at the same time, if you jump one chapter back, in chapter 24, in verse 13, it says, my son, eat honey. Why? For it is good. And the drippings of the honeycomb are sweet to your taste. I want to kind of come to this note because we're talking about self-control. We're talking about how to deal with it. We talked about whether or not it's a sin and how serious it is. We've talked about why it's a problem in our lives, why it's a problematic desire. I'm not telling you not to eat sweets. The Bible doesn't tell you not to eat sweets. Not that honey is that bad for you, but it says, my son, eat honey, for it is good, and the drippings of the honeycomb are sweet to your taste. There's a reason God gave us sweets. If God didn't want us to enjoy the occasional sweet, they wouldn't taste so good. God made them for us. But a little can go a long way. And if you can't stop yourself, then you need to stop yourself. You need to make sure that it doesn't master you, that you don't lose that control. So you can take this idea of honey and move it to food or to soft drinks. Anything that makes you bloat, things that cause inaction, things that cause cravings. If it's a problem for you, you need to limit it. Because otherwise, it can make you inactive. It can cause you to desire it too much. It can start taking you down that path. And if you think in this context, if you think along these lines, if you pay attention to what you're eating, how you're feeling, and where your desire is, do you not know when gluttony has a hold on you? If you're paying attention, can you not notice that desire creeping up? It does take practice and focus, and I'm not anywhere near that myself. I'm actually sort of like handling it now. I'm noticing it. That doesn't mean I'm not failing all the time, but I'm working at it, and it's made me feel better about the way that I do things. It's made me feel better about the way I act, the way I live, and it's helped me to kind of get other desires under control too, because it's a part of, as Paul said, disciplining your body, making sure that you can handle yourself and do what you want to do. And if nothing else, take away from this lesson that you need to keep it in mind and recognize when you've gone too far. Because if you start recognizing that, then it'll be all the more easy to focus on what's really important, and that is God. So to summarize, gluttony is tied to a lot of sins, a lot of them that have been prohibited, some that have been punished, but it is only a lack of self-control or abundance of desire. It is something that causes sin and is disapproved of in the Bible, but not necessarily condemned in of itself directly. If you read the same passages I did and you're like, no, it's definitely condemned itself directly, go with that, please. I didn't see enough to say, if you're good on everything else, but you eat too much, you're done. You didn't do it right. I didn't see that anywhere in here. Secondly, it can cause you to covet, to feel greed, to be inactive, to be lazy, to be rebellious, to put food before God, food before others, be inhospitable. It's a scary thing that can take you places that you wouldn't think it could go. It's not as scary to us in the public mindset as lust. We don't make fun of lust most of the time. At least the clean comedians don't. But we make fun of gluttony, and we need to keep it in our minds and take it seriously. Self-control is the key. It comes with focus. The first step, as they say in the Alcoholics Anonymous programs, first step is realizing the problem when it comes. Realize when you're overeating and be like, I should probably stop. I can eat this later. It's not going anywhere. I don't have to overeat. I don't have to eat all these sweets. In Romans chapter 14, I'll go ahead and close with this verse. Romans 14. Romans 14 is a passage where, and this is something that doesn't apply to us as much directly regarding food, but Paul is talking to Jews and Gentiles, and he says, you're free from Jewish dietary laws. But if somebody sees you eating things that you shouldn't be eating, sees you eating food that's sacrificed to idols at some point, or that is against the dietary laws or something like that, and it causes them to stumble, don't eat it. Hold yourself back. Keep self-control, because it's better for you to do that than to cause someone else to stumble, cause someone else to think that you're sinning. And then he says in verse 17 of chapter 14, for the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. The New Testament clearly establishes that eating and drinking different things is not, we don't have any dietary requirements anymore. We don't. The only thing that God requires of us is that we keep Him first and don't let our earthly desires master us. That's all He requires of us. And gluttony is one that we need to keep in mind, as are all of the others. Anything in excess can be bad. That's all I have for this morning. There's not really an invitation I can give that fits in well with the subject material. But if there are any sins that you need help with, if there are any prayers that you need to have made for you, if you need to be, I don't think there's anybody here that needs to be baptized, quite frankly. But if there is, and I don't know about it, then, and if you need the help of the church in any way, then now is a good time to come forward and ask for that, if you would, while we stand and while we sing.